Alice Jack's eyes fluttered open, her lashes heavy as a strange warmth settled around her. The scent of expensive cologne and fresh linen filled her senses, wrapping around her like an invisible mist. Sunlight streamed in through a massive window, casting golden streaks across the pristine white ceiling. For a moment she lay still, her mind sluggish, unwilling to wake up fully. But then, her pulse kicked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Something was wrong. This wasn't her tiny apartment. She sat up abruptly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bed beneath her was enormous, wrapped in silk sheets that felt too smooth against her skin. Her hands trembled as she ran them over the material, her fingers brushing against a fabric she didn't recognize. Her body stiffened as realization slammed into her. It wasn't hers. A cold shiver snaked down her spine. Her gaze darted around the room, her throat tightening. The furniture, dark wood, intricately carved, looked like something out of a luxury home magazine. A crystal chandelier dangled above her, its tiny lights glistening like frozen stars. The walls were a soft shade of gray, sleek and modern. Everything in this room screamed wealth, and it wasn't hers. Alice's breath turned shallow as her thoughts spiraled. Where was she? How had she ended up here? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to recall something, anything from the night before. But all she found was emptiness, a thick, suffocating void where her memories should have been. A wave of nausea churned in her stomach. Her dress? Where was it? Her shoes? Her purse? Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scrambled to pull the blanket around her tighter, her fingers clenching the fabric as if it could anchor her to reality. Then, the sound of a door creaking open. Her body went rigid. The air shifted. Soft footsteps padded against the polished floor. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she slowly turned her head toward the noise. A man stepped out of the bathroom. Tall, broad shoulders, dark damp hair curling slightly at the edges. A towel hung loosely around his neck as he ruffled his hair, drying it. The droplets of water on his skin glistened in the morning light, emphasizing the sharp angles of his chiseled jaw and toned chest. But it wasn't his physique that made Alice's breath hitch. It was his eyes, piercing green, deep, unreadable. They locked onto her instantly, pinning her in place. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then his lips parted. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep and smooth, calm yet carrying an edge of something she couldn't quite decipher. Alice swallowed, her throat dry as paper. Panic clawed at her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice coming out shakier than she intended. "Where am I?" The man's expression remained unreadable as he placed the towel down on a nearby chair. He took a step closer, but Alice instinctively scooted back, clutching the blanket around her. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly, as if he could sense her fear. "I'm Jorden Hayes," he said, his tone measured. "You're in my house." Alice's breath caught. Jorden Hayes. Her heart pounded against her ribs at the realization. The Jorden Hayes? The young millionaire entrepreneur whose face was plastered all over magazines. The one known for his ruthless business tactics, his wealth, and his carefully guarded private life. She had read about him, seen interviews, but standing in front of him now, half-dressed in his bed, felt like a twisted fever dream. This wasn't possible. There had to be a mistake. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Jorden exhaled and ran a hand through his damp hair, watching her carefully. "I know this is confusing," he said, his voice softer this time. But I need you to breathe. Breathe? How was she supposed to breathe when she had woken up in a stranger's bed, a millionaire's bed, with no memory of how she got there? Alice clenched the sheets, her mind spinning. What happened last night? She whispered. Why am I here? Jordan's eyes darkened, a flicker of something unreadable flashing through them. I was hoping you could tell me, he said. Alice's heart pounded against her ribs, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. Every second that passed, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in around her as her breath came in short, shallow bursts. Why am I in your bed? She demanded, her voice breaking. What happened last night? Jorden didn't move, didn't flinch at the desperation in her voice. Instead, he held her gaze, his green eyes calm but watchful, as if he understood the storm raging inside her. Nothing happened between us, he said firmly. You were in trouble, Alice. I found you wandering the streets, alone, terrified. You kept saying someone was following you. Alice's breath caught in her throat. Someone was following me? You were disoriented. I couldn't leave you like that. Her fingers dug into the silk blanket wrapped around her. Her mind screamed at her to remember, to piece together the hours that had been stolen from her. But all she found was a dark, empty void, an abyss where her memories should have been. I don't remember anything, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jorden nodded as if he had expected that. I had my housekeeper change you into something comfortable. I didn't want you waking up in the same clothes you were in last night. Alice's stomach twisted. His words were meant to comfort her, but the realization that she had been so vulnerable, so helpless, sent a shiver down her spine. She swallowed the rising panic, forcing her hands to steady. Think, Alice, think. She had gone out with Mia. They had planned for a fun night, a simple escape from the stress of their everyday lives. But after that, nothing. A blank space, a terrifying, suffocating void. Her pulse quickened as fear slithered through her veins. I need my phone, she whispered. Without hesitation, Jorden reached over to the nightstand and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed and she jerked her hand back, gripping the phone like a lifeline. Her screen lit up, dozens of missed calls. Her heart skipped as she scrolled through frantic messages, all from Mia. Mia, where are you? Mia. Alice, please answer me. Mia. You left without telling me. I'm so worried. Alice's fingers trembled as she tapped Mia's name, bringing the phone to her ear. It barely rang once before Mia picked up. Alice! Her best friend's voice burst through the speaker, frantic and breathless. Thank God! Where the hell are you? Alice closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. I don't know how, but I woke up in Jorden Hayes' house. Silence. Then what? Mia's scream was so loud that Alice had to pull the phone away from her ear. Jorden arched an eyebrow, clearly hearing Mia's outburst, but he remained quiet. Mia's breathing was heavy on the other end. Please tell me you remember what happened last night. Alice's throat tightened. I don't, she admitted. Mia, I don't remember anything after we got to the club. Mia's voice lowered, filled with something that made Alice's skin prickle. Alice, Mia whispered, I think someone drugged you. Alice's blood turned to ice. No, she whispered, shaking her head, as if she could physically reject the idea. That doesn't make sense. Alice, listen to me. Mia's voice was shaking now. You were fine 1 minute, and the next, you were gone. I looked everywhere. I thought you left with someone, but I couldn't find you. I tried calling you all night. Alice gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Drugged? The thought sent a sickening wave through her. Her mind flashed back to the darkness in her memories, the missing hours, the unshakable fear in her chest when she woke up. Something had happened to her, and she had no idea what. Jorden watched her, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. He must have seen the color drain from her skin because his voice was gentler when he spoke. "Do you want to call the police?" he asked. Alice opened her mouth to say yes, but hesitated. Something inside her clenched. Fear, uncertainty. If someone had drugged her, had tried to take advantage of her, what if they were still out there, watching, waiting? What if reporting it made things worse? Jorden must have seen the war on her face because he leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "You're not alone in this. If you need help, I'll make sure you get it." Alice looked at him, at the sincerity in his expression. She didn't know him, but for some reason, she believed him. Her grip on the phone tightened as her heart pounded against her ribs. She had a choice to make: stay silent and let the fear consume her, or fight back. Alice's stomach twisted painfully, her entire body going cold. "No, that can't be," she whispered, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mia's breath hitched on the other end. "Alice, I swear I only looked away for a second. You said you were going to get a drink, and when I turned back, you were gone." Alice's entire world tilted. Her chest felt tight, like she couldn't breathe properly. Gone. She had been gone. "I searched everywhere," Mia continued, her voice laced with panic and guilt. "I thought maybe you went to the bathroom or stepped outside for air, but then your phone went straight to voicemail. I asked the bartender, the security, everyone, but no one saw where you went. I thought you left with someone, but I never imagined—" Mia's voice cracked, and Alice felt tears sting the back of her own eyes. "Oh my God," Alice whispered. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperately trying to remember. The club, the music, the lights, the laughter, and then nothing. Just an empty void where the rest of the night should have been. She wrapped an arm around herself, her body trembling. How could this have happened? The idea that someone had drugged her, that someone had taken her without her even realizing, made her stomach lurch violently. She had always been careful, always cautious. She never left her drink unattended. She never accepted drinks from strangers. She always stuck with Mia. So how? Jordan's voice cut through her thoughts, steady and calm. "Do you want to call the police?" Alice's breath came in shallow gasps. The police. She should call them. She needed to call them. But fear gripped her like a vice. What if they didn't believe her? What if they asked for details she couldn't give because her mind was completely blank? What if the person who did this was still out there, watching, waiting? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She bit her lip hard, trying to ground herself, but nothing about this felt real. Jorden sat on the edge of the bed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't pressuring her, wasn't demanding answers. He was just waiting for her to decide. Alice glanced at him, her breath still shaky. Jorden Hayes. She barely knew him, but he had been the one to find her. He had brought her here, made sure she was safe. If his intentions had been anything but pure, she wouldn't have woken up in a silk nightgown, untouched and unharmed. Jordan's voice softened. "If you're scared, I can help. We can figure out who did this." Alice's heart pounded. She should be questioning why he cared so much, why a billionaire would waste his time helping her. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something unexpected, something fierce and unwavering, determination. And underneath that, rage. Not at her, but at whoever had done this to her. A lump formed in her throat. Could she trust him? Her entire body was screaming that she shouldn't, that trusting strangers was what had gotten her into this situation in the first place. But deep down, in the place that had been drowning in fear and uncertainty all morning, she felt something else. Hope. Alice swallowed hard. She didn't have all the answers yet. She didn't know who had done this to her. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to be a victim. She looked at Jorden, her hands still shaking, but her voice stronger than before. "Help me find out who did this." Jordan's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. "Consider it done." Jorden didn't waste time. He pulled out his phone and made a single call, his voice low but firm. "I need all surveillance footage from Club Mirage last night. Now!" Alice sat on the bed, gripping the sheets, her heart racing. This was happening. They were going to see what had happened to her. The thought both terrified and relieved her. Jorden hung up and turned to her. My security team is handling it. We'll have the footage within the hour. Alice nodded numbly. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She hugged herself, trying to suppress the overwhelming nausea twisting in her stomach. What if she saw something she couldn't handle? What if the truth was worse than she imagined? Jorden must have noticed her distress because he sat down across from her, his voice softer. You're not alone in this, Alice. She swallowed hard and nodded, though the fear in her chest didn't ease. An hour later, Jordan's head of security, a tall, intimidating man named Ray, arrived with a laptop. I have the footage, Ray said, setting the laptop on the glass coffee table. Alice's breath caught. This was it. Jorden gave her a questioning look. Are you ready? Number not even a little, but she nodded anyway. Ray pressed play. The video showed a high-angle view of Club Mirage's dimly lit bar. Alice and Mia stood together, laughing, the neon lights casting a colorful glow over them. Alice watched herself on the screen, so happy, so unaware of what was coming. A bartender slid a drink across the counter. She picked it up, smiling, oblivious. Then her stomach turned to ice. A shadowy figure entered the frame, a man in a dark jacket. He stood close, too close. His eyes were locked on Alice, watching her intently. Alice's fingers dug into the couch cushion as she leaned closer. She wanted to scream at the screen. Turn around. Notice him. Don't drink it. But past Alice couldn't hear her. The man lingered, glancing around, making sure no one was watching too closely. Then the moment Alice turned her head to say something to Mia, his hand moved over her drink. It happened so fast that if she had blinked, she would have missed it. Alice's breath hitched. Oh my God. The man casually backed away, pretending to check his phone. A few minutes later, the video showed Alice taking a sip. Her movements remained normal at first, but then she stumbled. Her posture slackened, her head tilting as if the world had suddenly become too heavy. The man moved toward her, his hand reaching out. Alice looked confused, dazed. She swayed on her feet, blinking rapidly, as if her vision had blurred. The man leaned in, whispering something. Alice weakly shook her head, but he gripped her arm. She tried to pull away, but she was too slow, too disoriented. Then, the footage jumped. 1 second, Alice was inside. The next, she was stumbling out of the club alone. Alice's body tensed. She hadn't been alone. He had been there. Had the cameras been tampered with? Or had he purposely led her somewhere out of view? Her heart pounded. Her attacker had been right there, inches from her, and she hadn't even known. Jordan's voice was ice cold. That's him. Alice swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she pointed at the screen. That's the guy who drugged me. Jordan's jaw tightened. His expression turned unreadable, but the storm in his eyes was unmistakable. Pure, unfiltered rage. We'll find him, he promised, his voice like steel. Alice exhaled shakily, her fingers clutching the couch cushions so tightly they turned numb. They had a face now, a lead. And for the first time since waking up in this nightmare, she wasn't just scared anymore. She was angry. Alice sat on the plush leather couch in Jordan's penthouse, gripping a steaming cup of tea between her trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, but it couldn't reach the cold fear still lodged deep in her chest. She had watched the footage over and over again, her heart shattering each time. The way she had stumbled, the way that man had reached for her, taken advantage of her vulnerability. She could have been lost forever. And the worst part, she wouldn't have even known how it happened. Jorden paced in front of her, his phone in hand, his movements sharp and tense. He had barely spoken since the security footage had confirmed their worst fear, that Alice had been drugged. But his silence wasn't indifference. It was rage, and it burned so fiercely she could almost feel it crackling in the air. Then, his phone buzzed. He answered immediately. Did you find him? His voice was clipped, lethal. Alice sucked in a breath. Ray's voice filtered through the speaker. We got a name. Brandon Marks. He's been reported before, but no charges ever stuck. He preys on clubs, always targeting women alone, or drunk. Alice's stomach twisted violently. A serial predator. Jordan's grip tightened on the phone. Not this time. Send everything to the police. I want him off the streets. Alice's head snapped up. The police? Jorden nodded. They need to know. And with your statement, plus the footage, this time he won't walk away. Alice's hands clenched into fists. She had spent the last 24 hours drowning in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of what had almost happened to her, fear that her attacker would never be caught. But now, that fear was turning into something else. Anger. She wasn't just another victim. She refused to be. Take me to the station, she said firmly. Jorden hesitated, scanning her face. Are you sure? Alice met his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Yes, I won't let him do this to someone else. The police station. The station smelled of coffee and paper, the low hum of voices filling the air as officers moved around with purpose. Alice sat across from Detective Monroe, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had already given her statement, every detail she could remember, which wasn't much, but it was enough. The footage, combined with her testimony, made the case airtight. Monroe leaned forward, his expression serious. Alice, because of you, we have enough to put this guy away. We've been building a case against him for months, but no one has ever come forward with solid evidence. Until now. A lump formed in Alice's throat. Does this mean he's going to jail? She whispered. Monroe nodded. We're issuing an arrest warrant as we speak. Alice let out a shaky breath. It was happening. Jorden, standing beside her, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing, he murmured. She turned to look at him, her chest tightening with emotion. She had almost become another statistic, another nameless victim in a world that too often ignored stories like hers. But because of Jorden, because of his help, his determination, she wasn't. She had fought back, and she had won. Justice served. 2 days later, Alice sat in Jorden's penthouse again, watching the news. Breaking news, serial predator Brandon Marks arrested after new evidence emerges. The screen showed his mugshot, his expression blank and lifeless. But Alice didn't feel sorry for him. He had stolen too much from too many women, but now he would never do it again. Alice set down the remote, exhaling slowly. The relief was overwhelming, almost crushing. Jorden sat beside her, watching her carefully. How do you feel? He asked. Alice thought for a moment. Relieved, angry, grateful, she admitted. Jorden nodded. Good. Hold on to that. Because you changed the outcome, Alice. You made sure he didn't win. A lump formed in her throat. The soft hum of the city filled the room, a distant symphony of life moving forward. Alice sat curled up on Jorden's sleek leather couch, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The skyline stretched before her, glowing with endless possibilities. It had been a few days since Brandon Marks had been arrested. The fear that had once gripped her so tightly was slowly beginning to fade. She was safe now. More importantly, she was free. But that didn't mean she wasn't changed. You didn't have to help me, she said softly, turning to Jorden. He sat across from her, relaxed, yet there was something unreadable in his sharp green eyes, something protective. Yes, I did, he said without hesitation. No one should have to go through that alone. Alice looked down, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had spent so much of her life believing she had to handle things on her own, that the world was too cruel to expect kindness. But Jorden had proven her wrong. When she had woken up lost and terrified, he had been there. When she had needed someone to believe her, to fight for her, he hadn't hesitated. She looked up at him and smiled. A real, genuine smile, the first in days. Thank you, Jorden. Really? He smirked, leaning back against the couch. Anytime. Just try to stay out of trouble, okay? Alice laughed, the sound light and easy, like a weight had been lifted from her chest. For so long she had defined herself by her fears. But not anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. And with people like Jorden in the world, maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Predators exist, but so do protectors. Speaking out, seeking justice, and supporting each other can make a difference. No one should suffer in silence.